Ever think old cartoons were innocent fun? Think again. Behind the cheerful jingles and bright colors, many family-friendly classics hid racism, propaganda, violence, and even drug culture. Today, we're unearthing 25 vintage cartoons so wild that they were banned. From episodes pulled from TV to entire series locked in studio vaults. Let's see what made them too shocking for Saturday morning. 1. The Censored 11, 1931 to 1944, Warner Brothers. Long before Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck became pop culture icons, Warner Brothers created a string of shorts that now live in infamy. Collectively called the Censored 11, these cartoons were pulled from circulation in 1968 for being too racist to air on television. The ban wasn't a small reaction. It was a sweeping decision from the studio itself, acknowledging that some of its own work had crossed an unforgivable line. The series included titles like Coal Black and The Seven Dwarves, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and All This, and Rabbit Stew. On paper, they were just slapstick comedies, but the jokes, voices, and drawings painted African Americans through exaggerated and demeaning stereotypes. Even by the standards of the 1930s, some critics found them uncomfortable. By the Civil Rights era, they were impossible to defend. Warner Brothers faced growing public pressure as television brought older cartoons back into living rooms. Parents were shocked by what their kids were watching. In 1968, the studio finally removed all 11 shorts from syndication, an unprecedented act of self-censorship in Hollywood. The reels weren't destroyed, though. They were quietly stored away, becoming a dark secret in animation history. Film scholars later rediscovered the cartoons and began studying them not for humor, but as historical evidence. They reflected how entertainment once normalized racist caricatures under the label of fun. Warner Brothers has never officially re-released them to the public, only screened them at academic events with heavy context. 2. Plain Dumb, 1932, Van Buren Studios. In 1932, the Van Buren Studio released a cartoon that now feels like a warning about how far ignorance can go when it hides behind humor. Plain Dumb was part of a short-lived series starring the early Tom and Jerry. Not the cat and mouse duo we know, but two human characters whose adventures were meant to be light entertainment. Instead, this one became one of the most offensive animations ever made. The short begins innocently enough. Two friends take a plane trip to Africa. But when the pair crash, the story spirals into something far uglier. To blend in, they smear their faces with black paint and start speaking in exaggerated minstrel voices. What follows is a parade of racial caricatures that's almost impossible to watch today. The native characters are drawn with grotesque features, shown as primitive, violent, and superstitious. Even the animals are given offensive traits that mock African cultures. At the time, such portrayals weren't unusual in cartoons. Studios often used racist stereotypes as easy comedy, but Plain Dumb stood out for how completely it leaned into those ideas. It wasn't just a bad joke. It was an entire short built around humiliation. The title itself played on the slur Plain Dumb, a cruel irony considering how thoughtlessly it treated its subjects. When television networks began replaying old cartoons in the 1950s and 60s, Plain Dumb didn't cut. It wasn't banned with a press release or public scandal, it was quietly buried. Stations simply refused to air it, and archives labeled it unsuitable. Collectors who stumbled upon bootleg copies decades later were stunned at how blatant the racism was. Today, Plain Dumb is studied not for nostalgia, but as a lesson in what happens when art mirrors prejudice without question. Animation historians point to it as a key example of how early American cartoons shaped racist attitudes through repetition and laughter. The short has never been officially re-released, and probably never will be. Watching even a few seconds makes one thing clear. Sometimes what's buried in the past deserves to stay there, not because it should be forgotten, but because it should be remembered for what it did wrong. 3. Red Hot Mama, 1934, Fleischer Studios. Betty Boop was once America's cartoon sweetheart, a flirty, carefree character who represented 1930s glamour. But in Red Hot Mama, she took a trip to a place that no censor could forgive. What started as a simple winter dream sequence turned into a fiery descent straight into hell, literally. And that's exactly what got this cartoon banned in several countries. The short opens with Betty falling asleep beside a fireplace on a cold winter night. In her dream, the warmth becomes unbearable, and she suddenly finds herself sinking into a cartoon version of hell. It's drawn with wild imagination. Red smoke, melting landscapes, and demons marching like soldiers. The animation was creative for its time, but the subject matter shocked audiences. In the 1930s, religion wasn't something you joked about, especially not with a cute character singing jazz tunes in front of Satan himself. Betty dances, sings hell's bells, and blows cold air at devils who try to grab her. It's playful, surreal, and disturbingly cheerful. The scene ends with her literally freezing the devil and waking up safe by her fireplace. To modernize, it might seem like harmless fantasy, but to 1930s censors, it was a scandal. Britain's film board declared it blasphemous for making light of eternal damnation. Religious groups in the United States demanded that Paramount withdraw it. Even theaters that wanted to show it were pressured to skip it. Despite the backlash, Red Hot Mama pushed animation forward in terms of creativity. The visual effects, liquid fire, morphing backgrounds, and bold use of color were ahead of their time. But its humor was simply too dark for the era. The idea of a cartoon woman flirting her way through hell crossed a line that audiences weren't ready for. For decades, the cartoon vanished from official circulation. When it resurfaced in private film archives, it became a symbol of early animation's rebellious streak, the moment when artists realized that even cartoons could question moral limits. 4. The Barnyard Battle, 1929. Disney. Before Mickey Mouse became the squeaky clean mascot of Disney, he starred in one of the studio's earliest banned films. The Barnyard Battle was supposed to be a fun story about mice defending their homeland from a gang of invading cats. But its wartime imagery hit too close to home in some countries, especially Germany, where it was officially banned for being offensive to national dignity. In short, Mickey is drafted into a mouse army and sent to fight a fierce cat battalion led by Pete, the classic Disney villain. The cats wear sharp, spiked helmets that look exactly like the Pickelhaube used by German soldiers during World War I. The connection wasn't subtle. The animation even parodied real war scenes, marching drills, military music, and comically exaggerated battles. To American audiences, it was a lighthearted satire. To German viewers in the early 1930s, it felt like a mockery of their army and national pride. The cartoon's humor also had a darker edge. Some scenes showed soldiers being crushed or blown away, which, while cartoonish, was still violent for the time. The short was made just over a decade after the end of the First World War, when memories of real loss were still raw. Germany's film censors didn't find it funny. They blocked the cartoon completely, making it one of the first Disney shorts ever banned in Europe. For Disney, the Barnyard Battle marked a turning point. It showed how even a simple cartoon could spark political outrage. The company quickly learned that international audiences viewed things differently, and that symbols, like helmets, uniforms, or national songs, carried meaning far beyond American humor. Today, the cartoon survives mostly in historical archives and online clips shared by animation historians. Its ban seems strange now, given how tame it looks compared to modern war parodies. But in 1929, Mickey's little army of mice represented more than just slapstick. It symbolized how powerful images could be, even in black and white. 5. The Skeleton Dance, 1929. Disney. When people think of Disney's early work, they picture cheerful animals, dancing flowers, and harmless fun. The Skeleton Dance flipped that image completely. It was eerie, clever, and unlike anything audiences had ever seen. 4 skeletons climbed out of their graves to dance under a full moon, turning a graveyard into a stage. There was no dialogue, just haunting xylophone music played on their own bones. It was artistic genius, but it scared audiences so much that Denmark banned it outright for being too macabre. The cartoon was part of Disney's Silly Symphonies series, a project that aimed to match music and movement in new ways. The Skeleton Dance was the very first entry, and Walt Disney took a creative risk by mixing horror with humor. Animator Ub Iwerks filled every frame with creepy details. Owls with glowing eyes, bats swooping across the screen, and skeletons who treated their bodies like instruments. In 1929, it was groundbreaking animation, but for viewers used to cheerful cartoons, it crossed a line. Seeing skeletons dance might sound funny today, but at the time, it felt like something pulled from a nightmare. The exaggerated movements, shrieking animals, and tombs bursting open were more horror film than children's cartoon. In Denmark, authorities thought it was simply too disturbing. They feared it would frighten children, so they banned it entirely. Other countries followed with heavy restrictions, airing it only in late-night theater programs for adults. Ironically, the controversy only made it more famous. In the United States, audiences lined up to see what all the fuss was about. Critics praised its creativity and rhythm, calling it a musical masterpiece of the macabre. Even today, film students study its timing and choreography. Over time, the skeleton dance became a Halloween staple, appreciated for its artistry instead of its shock value. It proved that animation didn't have to stay cheerful. It could experiment, unsettle, and even scare. For Walt Disney, it was an early reminder that creativity could be both admired and feared at the same time. 6. The Shindig, 1930 Disney. If you thought Mickey Mouse was all innocence and charm, The Shindig might surprise you. On the surface, it's a simple barn dance cartoon where Mickey and Minnie perform music while their animal friends join the fun. But hidden inside this cheerful tune-filled short was a blink-and-you-will-miss-it moment that caused quite a stir in Ohio. The state banned it completely, not for violence or politics, but for a cow reading a scandalous book. In one brief scene, Clarabelle Cow lounges before the party, flipping through a novel called 3 Weeks. That title might not sound dangerous today, but back in the 1930s, it was infamous, a racy romance known for its explicit themes. As soon as her friend Horace Horsecollar walks in, Clarabelle gasps, blushes, and hurriedly hides the book under some straw. It was meant as a quick joke for adults who recognized the reference, but censorship boards saw it as inappropriate for young audiences. The reaction was immediate. The Ohio Film Board labeled it immoral, claiming that Disney had smuggled sexual content into a children's cartoon. Local theaters were warned not to screen it, and many complied. It's hard to imagine now, but a cow reading a romance novel was enough to spark moral outrage. Disney quietly edited future prints, removing or shortening the shot for some markets. The irony is that the Shindig was otherwise wholesome. Mickey plays a tune on the piano, Minnie joins in with her signature charm, and farm animals dance in rhythm. It was one of the first shorts to show Mickey's growing popularity as a musical performer, yet all of that was overshadowed by a single prop, a book that turned a family cartoon into a censorship target. 7. Injun Trouble, 1969, Warner Brothers. By 1969, Warner Brothers had been making Looney Tunes for decades, but their final classic-era cartoon, Injun Trouble, closed the series with one of the worst decisions in their history. What was supposed to be a light comedy about a cool cat wandering through the West turned into a painfully racist mess. It was so offensive that it never saw a proper television release in the United States, and Warner Brothers has kept it buried ever since. The short follows Cool Cat, a hip tiger driving through the desert who stumbles into a Native American reservation. What unfolds is a chain of gags built entirely on crude stereotypes. The native characters are drawn with exaggerated features, speak in broken English, and perform nonsensical tribal dances. Some jokes go beyond bad taste. They're openly mocking. At one point, Cool Cat encounters a woman whose name is Shimmering Light, only for the cartoon to turn it into a cheap punchline. Even the title, Injun Trouble, used a racial slur. By the late 1960s, television networks were already under pressure to clean up offensive content, but this cartoon arrived as if time had stood still. Viewers and critics were appalled. Warner Brothers quietly shelved it after a brief theatrical run. Unlike other banned cartoons that resurfaced later for historical study, this one was so toxic that the studio refused to acknowledge it existed for years. Animation historians see Injun Trouble as a turning point, the moment when the old cartoon era collapsed under its own outdated attitudes. The jokes that once filled theaters with laughter now brought embarrassment. The timing made it worse. It came out the same year as Woodstock and the moon landing, in a world already reshaping its views on equality and culture. Because of that, Injun Trouble became infamous, not for what it did right, but for what it failed to understand. It clung to the past when audiences had moved on. Now it exists only in rare collector circles and low-quality bootlegs, studied as a cautionary tale about the limits of humor. 8. Tokyo Jokio and Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips, 1943 and 44 Warner Brothers. During World War II, nearly every major studio turned to propaganda. Cartoons became weapons of morale, designed to mock the enemy and boost American pride. But two Warner Brothers shorts, Tokyo Jokio and Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips, went far beyond comedy. Their portrayals of Japanese people were so extreme, so cruel, that both were later banned for good. What began as patriotic humor became a dark stain on animation history. Tokyo Jokyo presented itself as a parody newsreel from Japan. It showed Japanese soldiers and civilians as clumsy, cowardly, and grotesquely caricatured. Characters squinted, stumbled, and spoke in gibberish meant to mock the language. Even the title was a pun on Tokyo and joke, which summed up the cartoon's entire attitude. An entire nation reduced to punchlines. A year later came Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips, a cartoon that tried to merge wartime propaganda with slapstick comedy. Bugs finds himself on a Pacific island occupied by Japanese soldiers, and what follows is an avalanche of racial stereotypes. The soldiers are drawn with yellow skin, thick glasses, and buck teeth, speaking in distorted accents. Bugs tricks them, beats them up, and even disguises himself as a geisha to fool one of them. At the time, audiences laughed. Looking back, it's uncomfortable, even shocking, to see how normalized such imagery was. When World War II ended, the tone of America changed quickly. By the 1950s, the same cartoons that once played before newsreels felt cruel and embarrassing. Television networks refused to air them. Warner Brothers quietly pulled both titles from distribution, never including them in the regular Looney Tunes lineup again. Later generations discovered them only through rare film archives and collectors who preserved them for historical study. 9. Song of the South, 1946, Disney. Few Disney films are as famous for being unseen as Song of the South. Released in 1946, it was meant to be a warm story about friendship and folk tales. Instead, it became one of the most controversial films in Hollywood history. The movie mixed live action and animation to tell the story of Uncle Remus, an elderly black man who shares moral lessons through talking animals, and stories like Brer Rabbit. On the surface, it was about kindness and wisdom, but underneath, it carried a message that many people found deeply troubling. The film painted plantation life as joyful and peaceful, avoiding any mention of slavery or oppression. The black characters were shown happily working on the plantation, smiling and singing as if the Civil War and its cruelty had never happened. To post-war audiences in the South, it was nostalgic. To everyone else, it looked like an attempt to rewrite history. Disney had high hopes for Song of the South. The animation was stunning, and the song Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah even won an Academy Award. But within months of its release, civil rights groups began to protest. Critics accused the film of romanticizing the era of slavery and portraying harmful stereotypes. Some theaters refused to show it. Others edited scenes or pulled advertisements entirely. By the 1980s, Disney stopped releasing the movie altogether, even as fans asked for it to return for historical reasons. The company decided to lock it away instead of defending it. To this day, it's one of the few Disney films never officially released on home video or Disney Plus. Executives have said they don't plan to change that, calling it a product of its time, but not fit for modern audiences. Still, the film's legacy lingers. Its characters, Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, and Brer Bear, lived on in theme park rides and children's books, stripped of their original context. 10. Fantasia's Sunflower, 1940, Disney. When people talk about Fantasia, they remember the sweeping classical music, the dancing hippos, and Mickey Mouse as the sorcerer's apprentice. But there's a part of this legendary film that Disney doesn't talk about anymore. A character named Sunflower. She appeared for only a few seconds in the Pastoral Symphony segment, yet her presence was enough to get her quietly erased from every release after 1963. Sunflower was a small centaur with dark skin and exaggerated facial features, drawn in a way that reflected the racial caricatures of early Hollywood. Her role was to polish the hooves and brush the tails of lighter-skinned centaurs, who were depicted as elegant and beautiful. She wasn't given a voice, a personality, or even a name on screen. She existed only to serve. For decades, audiences barely noticed, but as social awareness changed, her image became impossible to ignore. During the civil rights movement, Disney began receiving criticism for outdated stereotypes in its older works. When Fantasia was re-released in 1963, the studio made a quiet decision. Sunflower was edited out completely. No press statement, no controversy, just silence. In her place, editors zoomed in on scenes or rearranged the animation so that viewers would never know she was there. It wasn't until the 1990s, when film historians uncovered original reels, that the public saw the missing footage again. The discovery sparked a debate. Should these scenes stay hidden, or be shown with context. Disney chose to keep them out, calling the removal an act of responsibility, not revisionism. Even today, Fantasia streams without Sunflower, her existence acknowledged only in academic discussions and restoration notes. 11. Lady and the Tramp's Siamese Cat, 1955, Disney. If you grew up humming the tune, "We Are Siamese If You Please," you probably didn't realize you were singing one of the most controversial songs in Disney history. The mischievous Siamese cats, C and M, appeared for only a short time in Lady and the Tramp, but their portrayal left a long shadow. What was meant as comic relief in 1955 is now viewed as one of Disney's most blatant examples of racial stereotyping. The scene is memorable. Two sleek cats with slanted eyes, sharp teeth, and sly grins slink through the house, causing chaos. They sing in exaggerated Oriental accents, plucking harp strings that mimic a stereotypical Asian scale. The lyrics make them sound sneaky, cunning, and untrustworthy, traits that echoed Western caricatures of Asians during the Cold War era. It wasn't the first time Disney used stereotypes for humor, but this one stuck. The catchy tune and playful animation helped mask the harm underneath. For decades, the song was simply accepted. It played on television, appeared in sing-along tapes, and even made its way into Disney parks. But as conversations about representation grew louder, the scene started to age badly. By the 1990s, many viewers and advocacy groups were calling it racist and outdated. Disney eventually took notice. In the 2019 live-action remake, the cats were replaced entirely. No slanted eyes, no accents, and a completely new song. Even the original version now carries a disclaimer on Disney+, warning that it contains negative depictions and/or mistreatment of people or cultures. The company decided not to edit it out but to confront it openly, a sign of how much times have changed. Looking back, the Siamese cats are a strange mix of charm and discomfort. The animation is clever, the song unforgettable, yet it represents a moment when Hollywood treated culture as costume. It turned identity into a joke. 12. The Adventures of Pow Wow, 1956, Screen Gems. In the 1950s, television animation was finding its rhythm, but The Adventures of Pow Wow showed just how careless that rhythm could be. The show tried to celebrate Native American culture, yet it did the exact opposite. Instead of teaching respect, it wrapped old stereotypes in bright colors and cheerful music, turning identity into a cartoon joke. The premise followed a young Native American boy named Pow Wow and his animal friends as they solved problems and learned tribal lessons. On the surface, it seemed harmless. Short, moral-driven stories meant for children. But look closer, and everything feels wrong. Pow Wow speaks in broken English, using phrases like, "Me go find buffalo now." His world mixes teepees, tom-toms, and totem poles from completely different tribes, as if all indigenous cultures were one. Even his name, Pow Wow, reduces centuries of history into a punchline. The show's educational segments were even worse. Between stories, brief lessons about native life appeared on screen, presented by a narrator who clearly didn't understand the culture he was describing. Children were told that all Native Americans worshipped the Great Spirit and communicated by smoke signals. None of it was accurate. It wasn't education, it was folklore twisted into a stereotype. When Native groups began seeing the show, they protested almost immediately. The National Congress of American Indians called it cultural harm disguised as entertainment. Veterans organizations joined the outcry, pointing out that real Native soldiers had fought for a country that still portrayed them as primitive. The backlash grew strong enough that by the early 1960s, most stations had stopped airing it. Despite that, The Adventures of Pow Wow still lingered in smaller markets and reruns, especially in regions with few Native voices to speak out. It wasn't until much later that historians revisited the series, calling it one of television's first examples of unintentional propaganda. The intention might have been to include diversity, but it showed how easily good intentions can turn into an insult when shaped by ignorance. 13. The Funny Company, 1963, Ken Snyder Productions. In the early 1960s, television producers wanted to make cartoons that felt educational and inclusive. The Funny Company sounded like a great idea on paper. A group of kids from different ethnic backgrounds working together on creative projects. The goal was to teach teamwork, curiosity, and respect for diversity. But what ended up on screen was a parade of stereotypes so clumsy that it triggered protests from civil rights groups and was eventually dropped by major stations. The show's creator, Ken Snyder, said he wanted to represent all of America's children. Unfortunately, his version of representation was painfully tone-deaf. Each character was written as a walking cliché. The black character, Jasper, spoke only in rhyme and was obsessed with music and watermelon jokes. The Asian girl, Mary Twitter, giggled constantly and bowed to everyone she met. A bird sidekick named Terry Dactyl had an exaggerated Mexican accent and was portrayed as lazy. Instead of celebrating diversity, the show turned identity into comedy. What made things worse was the way it tried to educate. Between the main stories, there were short cultural segments meant to teach children about the world. These clips showed Africa as nothing but mud huts and drums, Asia as dragons and fortune cookies, and Mexico as sombreros and siestas. It was supposed to build understanding. Instead, it built walls. The backlash came fast. Local NAACP chapters, the Congress of Racial Equality, and Jewish organizations condemned the show for spreading racist tropes. Protests erupted outside CBS offices in several cities. By the fifth episode, some stations had already pulled it off the air. The network tried minor edits but couldn't fix the underlying problem. The entire show was built on stereotypes. Even with the outrage, Snyder defended his creation for the rest of his career. He insisted he was promoting harmony, never realizing how harmful those portrayals were. Today, The Funny Company survives only in low-quality archives and academic studies. It's remembered as a classic example of good intentions gone wrong. Its failure taught an important lesson to television producers. Showing diversity isn't enough if the storytelling doesn't respect the people it represents. The Funny Company wanted to make kids laugh and learn, but it only proved how little its creators understood the world they were trying to teach. 14. Batfink, 1966, Hal Seeger. In the mid-60s, superhero cartoons were exploding in popularity. Kids wanted masked heroes, gadgets, and epic catchphrases. Batfink looked like a perfect fit. A parody of Batman featuring a heroic bat with metallic wings and his loyal sidekick, Karate. But this show didn't just parody the genre. It stumbled into something worse. Within a year of its debut, stations across the country started dropping episodes, calling them offensive, tone-deaf, and even morally questionable. At first glance, Batfink seemed harmless. The main character was a crime-fighting bat with steel wings that could deflect bullets and a sharp sense of justice. His partner, Karate, was a muscle-bound man who helped him battle villains like Hugo A. Go-Go, a mad scientist bent on world domination. The problem wasn't the action or the gadgets. It was how the show portrayed people. Karate was drawn and voiced as a crude Asian stereotype. He spoke in broken English, bowed constantly, and cracked wise sayings that made no sense. His entire character existed as a punchline. To make matters worse, Hugo A. Go-Go's design borrowed from Cold War caricatures of Eastern Europeans, complete with exaggerated accents and unhinged behavior. Parents and advocacy groups quickly caught on. Letters poured into networks complaining that the show was teaching kids to laugh at cultural stereotypes. Things got even more controversial with an episode titled The Atom Boom. It turned a joke about atomic power into a comedy plot. During the height of nuclear fear, with schoolchildren practicing duck and cover drills, Batfink treated atomic warfare as slapstick humor. The timing couldn't have been worse. Within months, NBC affiliates in New York and California stopped airing the show entirely. Hal Seeger, the show's creator, defended it as lighthearted satire, but the backlash never died down. By 1968, Batfink had quietly disappeared from most major markets. 15. The Beagles, 1967 CBS. In 1966, CBS tried to cash in on Beatlemania with a cartoon that blended music, humor, and adorable talking animals. The result was The Beagles, a show about two singing dogs named Stringer and Tubby, who performed as a rock band. On paper, it sounded like a sure hit. Think of the Beatles, but with wagging tails and guitars. But the moment it aired, controversy followed. The problem wasn't just imitation. It was what the show was imitating. The Beagles didn't just borrow the band's style. They parodied their image, lifestyle, and the drug-heavy counterculture that surrounded 1960s rock music. In one episode, the characters visit a groovy pad filled with animals swaying to music, eyes half shut, talking about expanding their minds. Parents didn't need much imagination to know what that meant. Newspapers called it psychedelia for kids. CBS thought the references would fly over young viewers' heads. But adults saw exactly what was happening. Complaints started pouring in from parent associations and religious groups, accusing the network of sneaking drug references into a children's show. To make matters worse, the Beatles' management team took notice. The songs on the Beagles were original, but so similar in melody and rhythm that lawyers sent CBS a cease and desist letter. Between the legal pressure and moral outrage, the network had little choice but to pull the plug. Only 26 episodes were ever produced, and most of them vanished when CBS cleared out its archives in the 1970s. The few surviving reels show how surreal the show really was. Beyond the drug imagery and music parodies, it had strange adult undertones, romantic jokes, counterculture slang, and scenes that made more sense to beatniks than to children. Animation historians now view the Beagles as a symbol of the moment when kids' television tried to mirror pop culture and crashed headfirst into censorship. It's one of those rare cartoons that managed to offend parents, lawyers, and even the very band it was copying, all at once. 16. Sinbad Jr., 1965, Hanna-Barbera. By the mid-1960s, Hanna-Barbera ruled Saturday mornings. Every show they touched, the Flintstones, the Jetsons, and Scooby-Doo, turned into a hit. So when they announced Sinbad Jr., expectations were sky high. The concept seemed easy to sell. The legendary sailor's adventurous son traveling the world with his talking parrot, Salty. But this time, Hanna-Barbera's magic failed. Instead of a family favorite, Sinbad Jr. became one of the few cartoons the studio wished it could erase. At first, the show was meant to mix fantasy and adventure, with Sinbad Jr. fighting pirates and mythical monsters. But the writers made one big mistake. They set the story in the modern Middle East. The decision was meant to make it feel current and exciting, but it instantly clashed with the political tensions of the era. This was the 1960s, the Cold War, oil crises, and a growing Western misunderstanding of Middle Eastern culture. Turning that region into a backdrop for exotic adventures didn't play well, especially when the characters were stereotypes instead of people. Sinbad Jr. and his sidekicks sailed through desert cities filled with characters who all sounded the same. Thick, exaggerated accents, mysterious merchants, and villains in turbans. The imagery blurred together every Middle Eastern and South Asian culture into one cartoon fantasy. It wasn't just inaccurate, it was insulting. Arab American organizations noticed quickly. The newly formed American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee launched letter-writing campaigns and even called for advertisers to pull their support. Meanwhile, international audiences were outraged. Middle Eastern governments sent formal complaints to U.S. broadcasters, accusing the show of promoting racism. The issue reached the State Department, which quietly urged ABC to step in before it became a diplomatic problem. ABC pulled Sinbad Jr. after only one season. Hanna-Barbera tried to rework it into a more generic adventure series set at sea, but the reputation was ruined. By 1966, the cartoon disappeared from schedules, and the studio stopped mentioning it altogether. 17. Rocket Robin Hood, 1966-69, CBC. If you ever wondered what would happen if Robin Hood smoked something strange and blasted off into space, Rocket Robin Hood has your answer. This Canadian cartoon was supposed to be a futuristic retelling of the classic outlaw legend, bold, imaginative, and full of adventure. What it became was a cosmic fever dream that confused parents, terrified teachers, and eventually got banned from several stations for being psychologically harmful to children. The setup was simple enough. It's the year 3000, and Robin Hood's descendants steal from the rich and give to the poor across the galaxy. But the execution, pure chaos. The animation was crude, even by 1960s standards. Characters barely moved, and backgrounds looped endlessly. Then came the dialogue, a swirl of nonsensical phrases about cosmic energy and the intergalactic tree of evil. Episodes often ended without any resolution, as if someone had forgotten to write the last 5 minutes. It didn't take long for adults to notice that something felt off. The scripts made no sense, the pacing was manic, and the sound design seemed designed to melt your brain. Some psychologists even warned that it could distort how children understood reality and logic. In one episode, Robin defeats a villain by reversing the polarity of imagination. In another, he sings the square root of purple. The absurdity became legend. Behind the scenes, the chaos was real. Animators later admitted they were experimenting with stream-of-consciousness storytelling, inspired by 1960s counterculture and surrealist art. Unfortunately, what worked for adults at midnight didn't work for kids on Saturday morning. Parents sent angry letters. Teachers complained that their students were talking in gibberish at school, repeating lines from the show. CBC tried to defend it as creative expression, but the backlash kept growing. By 1969, Rocket Robin Hood was quietly pulled from most Canadian and US stations. CBC kept a few episodes archived, but stopped syndicating it completely. Over time, the show became a cult curiosity. So bad, it was fascinating. 18. Courageous Cat and Minute Mouse. 1960 Bob Kane. Imagine the creator of Batman deciding to make a kid's parody of his own superhero and accidentally creating one of the most violent cartoons of its time. That's Courageous Cat and Minute Mouse. It was the brainchild of Bob Kane, the same man who brought The Dark Knight to life. But instead of moody storytelling and moral lessons, this cartoon gave kids a cat vigilante armed with real weapons, questionable judgment, and a sidekick who never stopped getting hurt. The show's premise was simple. Courageous Cat, the feline hero, and his partner, Minute Mouse, protected Empire City from absurd villains. On paper, it was lighthearted fun, complete with bright colors and fast-paced chases. In practice, it was pure mayhem. Each episode featured explosions, gunfire, and exaggerated fight scenes where bones cracked, buildings collapsed, and villains were literally blasted out of the frame. Parents were horrified, not just by the violence, but by the way the show treated it as normal. Courageous Cat didn't use clever traps or non-lethal gadgets like Batman. He carried a cat gun, a handheld weapon that fired actual bullets, ice pellets, smoke bombs, and fireballs. He didn't outwit his enemies. He torched them, froze them, or shot them into unconsciousness. Kids started mimicking the behavior, building makeshift cat guns out of toy parts and sticks. Teachers reported playground fights where children shouted, "Freeze, villain!" before hitting each other with improvised weapons. It didn't take long for schools and parent associations to start writing letters. The show's tone didn't help. Courageous Cat caused as much damage as the criminals he fought, often destroying half the city while saving it. One episode ends with him leveling an entire block just to stop a jewel thief. Critics called it a parody of heroism that forgot to include the parody. In 1962, several networks had stopped airing reruns. Some stations replaced it with gentler fare, like The Alvin Show or Huckleberry Hound. Bob Kane defended the cartoon as comic exaggeration, but the public didn't buy it. 19. Hot Wheels. 1969. Mattel, ABC. By the late 1960s, toy companies had figured out that kids didn't just want toys. They wanted worlds built around them. Mattel, fresh off the success of its new die-cast cars, decided to take that idea one step further. Why stop at toy shelves when you could invade Saturday mornings too? And so came Hot Wheels, a cartoon that looked like a racing adventure but turned out to be something else entirely. A 30-minute commercial disguised as a show. The premise revolved around a group of teenage racers led by Jack Wheeler, a clean-cut hero who competed in high-speed races, solved problems, and promoted good sportsmanship. It all sounded wholesome, except for one major issue. Every car featured in the cartoon was an exact model sold in toy stores that same week. Each new episode introduced new vehicles, all of which were conveniently arriving on store shelves at the same time. Parents might not have noticed, but advocacy groups and rival toy companies did. Complaints poured into the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, accusing ABC and Mattel of manipulating children through covert advertising. According to the rules of the time, children's shows couldn't function as commercials. Mattel argued that Hot Wheels was educational. It taught driving safety and responsibility. But internal memos later revealed what everyone suspected. Episodes were planned around toy releases. The FCC investigated, and the fallout was huge. Rival companies like Matchbox and Johnny Lightning testified that Hot Wheels gave Mattel an unfair advantage. The show wasn't just breaking the spirit of the law, it was breaking the market. By 1971, the FCC ruled that the cartoon violated broadcasting standards and banned it from airing. ABC canceled it immediately, and Mattel was prohibited from producing any television content for 5 years. Ironically, The controversy only made the toys more popular. Kids wanted the cars they weren't allowed to see anymore, and sales skyrocketed. Hot Wheels became a case study in marketing ethics, showing how blurred the line between entertainment and advertising could become. 20. Good News, 1962, Warner Brothers. Not every banned cartoon was hidden for political reasons. Some were just too grim for their own good. Good News, a 1962 Warner Brothers short featuring Daffy Duck, is one of those cases. It wasn't pulled for racism or propaganda, but for turning gallows humor into something uncomfortably literal. What was meant to be dark comedy ended up looking like a how-to guide for self-endangerment, and it quickly vanished from television schedules. The short begins with Daffy stowing away on a ship, trying to avoid being caught by its sadistic captain and his talking parrot, Mr. Tristan. When the crew discovers him, they prepare to hang him. Yes, an actual hanging, for being a stowaway. To escape, Daffy pretends to be a famous magician, performing daring tricks to win their favor. What follows is a series of dangerous escape acts, one of which involves Daffy locking himself inside a chest and nearly suffocating. The parrot sabotages his tricks. The gallows looms larger each time, and the cartoon's tone gets darker by the minute. For 1960s audiences, the humor felt off. It wasn't slapstick anymore. It was anxiety. The jokes revolved around Daffy's fear of death and the threat of being hanged, visualized through ropes, knots, and close calls. Even the title, Good News, played on words that no one found funny. When TV syndication of Looney Tunes began in the following decade, networks took one look at the short and quietly removed it from rotation. Censors argued that the imagery was imitable behavior. Kids, after all, had a tendency to copy cartoon stunts, and this one featured plenty of ropes, chests, and suffocation scenes. Some broadcasters even called it dangerous to re-air. The cartoon became a rarity, surviving only on collector reels in university archives. In hindsight, Good News feels like a strange experiment, Warner Brothers trying to mix dark humor with their usual zany formula. But it crossed a boundary that the studio never revisited. Daffy, once the loud, egotistical goofball, looked helpless and desperate here. The laughs felt nervous. 21. Hoplo from Fantasia, 1940 Disney. If you've ever watched Fantasia, you know it's not your typical Disney movie. No talking animals, no clear story, just music, color, and imagination. But one small mushroom managed to cause enough trouble to get quietly erased from later versions of the film. His name was Hop Lo, and what looked like an innocent dance turned into one of Disney's earliest cases of cultural controversy. Hop Lo appeared in the Dance of the Mushrooms sequence of Fantasia. Picture a line of tall, elegant mushrooms swaying gracefully to Tchaikovsky's Chinese dance. Then out pops Hop Lo, the tiniest mushroom, shorter than the rest, stumbling out of rhythm and nervously trying to keep up. On the surface, it's a cute gag about a little guy trying to fit in. But as audiences and critics looked closer, the design and animation began raising eyebrows. Hop Lo's slanted eyes, exaggerated movements, and timid mannerisms resembled Asian caricatures common in early Hollywood. The sequence was even called the Chinese Dance in production notes, and the movements were meant to mimic traditional Chinese performance styles, but filtered through Western stereotypes. By the early 1960s, as cultural awareness evolved, Disney quietly cut or edited the scene for re-releases. Hop Lo vanished from the spotlight, never officially banned, but effectively retired. Disney didn't issue a public statement about the change. Instead, they handled it the way studios often did back then, by pretending it never happened. Later generations who watched Fantasia on VHS or DVD likely never even noticed his absence. For historians, though, Hop Lo became a small but important symbol of how early animation reflected casual cultural insensitivity. It's hard to call the sequence malicious. It wasn't mocking, just misinformed. But it's a reminder of how even a gentle, wordless cartoon could carry outdated assumptions about how to represent other cultures. 22. Bosco, 1930s Warner Brothers. Before Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck ruled the screen, Warner Brothers had another star, Bosco. He was the studio's first recurring cartoon character, and in many ways the prototype for everything that came after. But as charming as he seemed in the early 1930s, Bosco's design and voice carried something deeply uncomfortable. He wasn't just a cartoon boy. He was drawn in the image of a minstrel performer, based on blackface caricatures from early vaudeville. That legacy would eventually get him banned from syndication and quietly erased from Warner Brothers history. Bosco was created by animators Hugh Harman and Rudolph Ising, who had once worked with Walt Disney. They wanted to make a cheerful, musical character, someone full of energy and fun. In his debut, Bosco sang, danced, and spoke in a Southern-style dialect. To 1930s audiences, it looked and sounded familiar, but not in a good way. His round lips, exaggerated expressions, and accent all mimicked racist minstrel imagery that was still common in American entertainment. At the time, no one in Hollywood questioned it. Bosco became the face of Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, appearing in dozens of shorts filled with jazzy music and slapstick humor. But as cultural awareness evolved, the character's design grew harder to defend. By the mid-1940s, Warner Brothers had quietly replaced him with other characters, pretending he'd never existed. When television brought old cartoons back in the 1950s, networks refused to air Bosco's early shorts altogether. Decades later, animation historians tried to re-examine Bosco's place in film history. Some argued that he was simply an early cartoon design, and that his creators didn't intend racism. Others pointed out that intent doesn't erase impact. The imagery was still drawn from a harmful tradition. Modern audiences who rediscovered his shorts online were shocked that such a character ever led the Looney Tunes franchise. 23. Mammy Two Shoes, 1940s Tom and Jerry. Anyone who's ever watched classic Tom and Jerry remembers the mysterious woman whose slippers stomped across the screen, scolding Tom in a thick Southern accent. You never saw her face, just her legs, apron, and voice. That was Mammy Two Shoes, one of animation's most recognizable but also most controversial side characters. For years, she was a fixture in the series. Then, without explanation, she disappeared. What happened was a quiet erasure, rooted in a growing understanding of racial stereotypes in media. Mammy Two Shoes first appeared in 1940's Puss Gets the Boot, the very first Tom and Jerry cartoon. She was voiced by actress Lillian Randolph, a talented African-American performer whose delivery gave the character warmth and authority. But the problem wasn't her performance, it was the portrayal itself. Mammy was written and animated as a caricature of a mammy figure, a stereotype that originated during the slavery era and persisted through the early 20th century. She was shown as a heavy-set black housekeeper who scolded Tom in exaggerated dialect, reinforcing outdated tropes of servitude and simplicity. To audiences in the 1940s, this wasn't unusual. Hollywood was filled with similar portrayals. But as civil rights movements grew in the 1950s and 60s, so did discomfort with these depictions. Television stations began receiving complaints about how the character represented black women. Some networks responded by dubbing over her lines with a neutral voice and claiming she was Irish or white. Others cropped her out entirely, reframing shots to remove her presence. By the 1980s, Mammy Two Shoes was replaced in syndicated versions with a redesigned white woman, her voice re-recorded by Thea Vidal in some edits. The original prints were locked away, rarely broadcast again. Even when Warner Brothers and MGM restored old Tom and Jerry cartoons for DVD, they included disclaimers warning viewers of outdated stereotypes. Still, the debate continues. Some historians argue that removing Mammy Two Shoes entirely erases both the problem and the progress made in addressing it. Others believe that leaving her in without context risks normalizing harmful imagery. 24. Song of the South, 1946 Disney. Few Disney productions have sparked as much debate, denial, and discomfort as Song of the South. When it premiered in 1946, it was meant to celebrate folklore, music, and storytelling through live action blended with animation. But what Disney thought was a nostalgic look at post-Civil War America quickly turned into one of the most criticized films in the company's history. Over time, the controversy grew so large that Disney effectively banned its own movie. The story follows a young boy named Johnny, who visits his grandmother's plantation in the Reconstruction-era South. There, he befriends Uncle Remus, a kind storyteller who shares animated tales about clever Brer Rabbit and his misadventures. On the surface, it's a cheerful blend of heartwarming lessons and catchy songs like Zip-a-dee-doo-dah. But beneath the music and charm, critics saw something else, an idealized version of plantation life, one that erased the brutal reality of slavery and racial inequality. The problem wasn't with Uncle Remus himself, played sincerely by James Baskett, who even won an honorary Academy Award for his performance. It was how the film depicted his world, The plantation setting was presented as harmonious, with smiling black workers happily serving white families. There was no mention of history, no context for why this piece existed. For audiences in 1946, this portrayal might have felt comforting. For everyone who came after, it felt dishonest. Civil rights groups began protesting the film not long after its release. By the 1970s, Disney stopped re-releasing it in theaters. When home video arrived in the 1980s, Song of the South was quietly left out of every format. To this day, it has never been made available on Disney+, and the company avoids referencing it publicly. Even the popular Splash Mountain ride, originally inspired by the film, was recently re-themed to remove any connection. Even with the controversy, Song of the South remains an important case study. It shows how a film can be technically innovative, yet socially tone-deaf. The animation and live-action blending were groundbreaking, but the message behind them aged poorly. 25. The Adventures of Pow Wow, 1950s Screen Gems. If you ever wanted a masterclass in how not to represent a culture, The Adventures of Pow Wow is it. Produced in the late 1950s by Screen Gems, this short-lived cartoon followed a young Native American boy named Pow Wow as he embarked on adventures across the Old West. To its creators, it was harmless fun. To Native audiences, it was an exhausting parade of stereotypes, and one that quickly got the show banned in multiple regions. The animation was simple and cheerful, with Pow Wow accompanied by his animal friends in short stories about bravery, wisdom, and tribal traditions. The problem was, none of those traditions were accurate. The show mashed together elements from entirely different native nations, turning distinct cultural symbols into cartoon props. Pow Wow's tribe wore plains headdresses, lived in teepees, and carved totem poles, all from completely separate indigenous groups. His dialogue was worse. Lines like, "Me go hunt buffalo now," became running jokes, turning a living culture into a childlike caricature. At first, few people questioned it, but as the civil rights movement gained strength in the 1960s, Native American advocacy groups began pushing back. The National Congress of American Indians called the series cultural vandalism. Parents groups joined in, demanding that TV stations pull the show from rotation. Even the Bureau of Indian Affairs criticized it for misinforming young viewers about Native life. The backlash grew strong enough that several major cities, including New York and Los Angeles, stopped airing it altogether. The show's creators claimed it was meant to honor Native heritage, but intention couldn't save it from what it actually showed. Each episode reinforced the noble savage myth, with Pow Wow portrayed as mystical and naive, solving problems through animal magic or ancient wisdom. Meanwhile, white settlers were depicted as civilized helpers or mentors. By the early 1960s, The Adventures of Pow Wow quietly disappeared from broadcast schedules. Screen Gems never publicly apologized. They simply moved on. Now, the few surviving episodes resurface occasionally in film archives or YouTube uploads, usually as examples of how American media once treated indigenous stories as exotic fantasy rather than lived experience. 26. Red Hot Mama, 1934, Betty Boop. When Betty Boop first appeared on screen, she was the face of carefree jazz-age rebellion, a flirty, fun symbol of 1930s animation. But in Red Hot Mama, released in 1934, her charm went straight to hell, literally, and it landed the cartoon in trouble across multiple countries. What was meant to be a playful dream sequence about temptation and heat turned into one of the earliest examples of a cartoon banned for religious indecency. The short begins with Betty asleep by her fireplace on a freezing winter night. As she drifts off, the room melts away, and she finds herself in the fiery depths of hell. Demons scurry around like students in a bizarre classroom, getting roasted black as part of their training. Betty performs Hell's Bells, a sultry jazz tune that lights up the infernal crowd. Then, when Satan himself turns up the heat a little too much, Betty cools the flames with her icy breath before waking up safe and shivering back in her room. The cartoon's humor was classic Fleischer Studios, surreal, musical, and a little mischievous. But 1930s audiences weren't ready to laugh at hell. Religious groups protested that the film made a mockery of damnation, portraying Satan as a comic figure and hell as a nightclub. The British Board of Film Censors outright banned the short, calling it blasphemous. Germany and a few US cities followed suit, refusing to screen it in theaters. Even some American church groups lobbied against it, claiming it tempted moral confusion in youth. For the Fleischers, who were known for pushing creative boundaries, the reaction was shocking. They'd meant it as a harmless dream cartoon, not a theological statement. But the controversy stuck, and Red Hot Mama quietly disappeared from circulation. For decades, it wasn't included in TV reruns or film collections, surviving mostly through archival prints. The animation is gorgeous, the humor tame by modern standards. Still, Red Hot Mama holds a unique place in history. It showed that even the underworld could get a cartoon banned. What was once seen as scandalous now feels like an oddly charming peek into a time when imagination itself could cross the line. 27. The Censored 11, 1931-1944 Warner Brothers. Between 1931 and 1944, Warner Brothers released hundreds of Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies shorts, bright, bouncy, and often brilliant. But 11 of them were so steeped in racist caricature that even the studio later disowned them. Known collectively as the Censored 11, these cartoons weren't just pulled from television. They were locked away completely, forbidden from being shown in any official capacity for decades. The titles sound harmless: Jungle Jitters, Coal Black and the Seven Dwarfs, Sunday Go to Meetin' Time. But each one reflected the casual racism that shaped early animation. Black characters were drawn with exaggerated lips, bug eyes, and voices that mimicked minstrel shows. Entire plots revolved around harmful stereotypes, portraying African Americans as lazy, superstitious, or foolish. Even when the animation was technically impressive, the message underneath was impossible to ignore. In 1968, as the civil rights movement reshaped American media, United Artists, then the distributor of Warner Brothers' cartoon library, made a historic decision. They banned those 11 shorts from all television syndication. No edits, no disclaimers, just total removal. The list included Hittin' the Trail for Hallelujah Land, Clean Pastures, Uncle Tom's Bungalow, Angel Puss, and others that had once been standard Saturday morning fare. The studio reasoned that even with context, the damage outweighed any historical value for general audiences. For years, the films vanished entirely. In the 1980s, animation historians began lobbying for their restoration, not to excuse them, but to study them. The debate remains intense. Some believe these cartoons should be preserved as evidence of how mainstream racism was in entertainment. Others argue that airing them, even with disclaimers, risks normalizing offensive imagery. What's undeniable is their influence. The Censored 11 revealed just how deeply racial caricature was embedded in early Hollywood. Even Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck inherited comedic rhythms from minstrel shows, though softened over time. Seeing these 11 films in context forces viewers to confront where animation started, and how far it still has to go. Warner Brothers occasionally acknowledges them in documentaries, but has never reissued them publicly. They serve as a grim mirror, reflecting the biases that once passed as humor. For every laugh they once earned, they now stand as a sobering reminder that art evolves only when it finally faces what it got wrong. 28. Injun Trouble, 1969 Warner Brothers. When Injun Trouble hit theaters in 1969, no one realized it would become both the final Looney Tunes short of the classic era and one of the most infamous. Meant to star Cool Cat, a hip, sunglasses-wearing feline trying to appeal to the groovy youth culture of the time, the cartoon instead became a disastrous display of outdated stereotypes that landed it on the industry's permanent blacklist. The story follows Cool Cat driving his car through a Native American reservation, cracking jokes, and running into a series of comical situations. The problem is that every single gag relies on racist caricatures. Native characters are drawn with red skin, huge noses, and exaggerated accents. Their dialogue is a mix of broken English and mock tribal chants. One scene shows a native character cutting a hole in a background painting to peek through. A joke so nonsensical, it only added to the offense. The title itself, Injun Trouble, used a slur that was already falling out of favor by the late 1960s, signaling how tone-deaf the cartoon truly was. What made it worse was the timing. The civil rights movement had already transformed public sensitivity toward race, and television networks were actively pulling older, offensive cartoons from syndication. By the time Injun Trouble arrived, audiences weren't laughing. They were appalled. Critics panned it as embarrassing and unwatchable. Native American groups condemned it immediately, calling it mockery masquerading as comedy. Warner Brothers reacted fast. After only a brief theatrical run, the company withdrew the cartoon completely. It was never released on television, VHS, or DVD. In fact, Warner Brothers has gone so far as to leave it out of nearly every official Looney Tunes collection. The only copies that exist today come from private film collectors or academic archives. It's a strange legacy for what was meant to be a lighthearted send-off. Instead of celebrating Warner's history, Injun Trouble became a cautionary tale about how not to adapt humor for a changing world. 29. Speedy Gonzales, 1953, Looney Tunes. He's fast, he's loud, and for decades he was one of the most popular faces in the Looney Tunes lineup. Speedy Gonzales, the fastest mouse in all Mexico, zipped across screens in a blur of sombreros, shouts of "Andale," "Arriba," and slapstick chases. Kids adored him, but as times changed, critics started asking a harder question. Was Speedy a proud symbol of Mexican culture, or a stereotype wrapped in a punchline? That question eventually led to his temporary ban from television. When Speedy debuted in 1953, Warner Brothers saw him as a fun, heroic character. He was clever, quick, and always outsmarting bigger, meaner cats, especially Sylvester. But his exaggerated accent, oversized hat, and the way the show depicted his village sparked concern. Mexican peasants were shown as lazy or drunk, while Speedy was the lone industrious hero. The humor leaned on cliches rather than culture, and by the 1980s, broadcasters started to take notice. In the early 1990s, Cartoon Network quietly removed all Speedy Gonzales cartoons from syndication, citing ethnic stereotyping. For nearly a decade, he vanished from U.S. screens. Ironically, that move drew backlash from Latino audiences themselves. Fans across Mexico and Latin America flooded Warner Brothers with letters defending Speedy as a rare positive figure in American media. A smart, brave Mexican who always won. The League of United Latin American Citizens, LULACI, even campaigned for his return, calling him a cultural icon, not a caricature. Their message worked. By the early 2000s, Warner Brothers reinstated Speedy, and his cartoons began airing again, this time with disclaimers acknowledging the period's cultural context. New projects like The Looney Tunes Show gave him a modern makeover, keeping his confidence and charm, but softening the stereotypes. What makes Speedy's story unique is that it didn't end in censorship. It evolved. He went from banned to beloved, from punchline to pride. While early versions of the character absolutely leaned on lazy writing, later portrayals reframed him as a symbol of quick wit and cultural resilience. In a way, Speedy Gonzales outran his own controversy. He's still sprinting across screens today. Proof that some characters can survive their flaws if studios are willing to listen, learn, and adapt. 30. Pokémon Electric Soldier Porygon, 1997 Japan. Few cartoons have ever caused real physical harm to their audience, but in December 1997, Pokémon did exactly that. The episode titled Electric Soldier Porygon became infamous overnight, not for violence or politics, but for accidentally sending hundreds of children to hospitals across Japan. What started as a normal broadcast turned into a national emergency that changed how animation was regulated forever. The story itself was simple. Ash and Pikachu travel inside a digital world to stop Team Rocket's computer virus, aided by a new Pokémon named Porygon. The problem came during a battle sequence. At one point, Pikachu uses his Thunderbolt attack to stop incoming missiles. The animators used rapid red and blue strobe effects to simulate an explosion inside cyberspace. Those flashing lights pulsed at a frequency that triggered seizures, nausea, and temporary blindness in sensitive viewers. Within minutes, chaos broke out across Japan. Parents called emergency services as children collapsed in front of their televisions. More than 600 kids were hospitalized that night. News crews showed up at emergency rooms. The next day, Pokémon was pulled from every network, and the government launched an investigation. Scientists later confirmed the cause: photosensitive epilepsy, triggered by the cartoon's flashing sequence. The fallout was immediate and massive. Pokémon went off the air for 4 months. The episode was banned permanently, never re-aired anywhere. And Porygon, the Pokémon at the center of the story, was unofficially blacklisted from the franchise. Even though Pikachu caused the flash, Porygon was unfairly blamed, disappearing from future episodes and movies for over 2 decades. The incident, now known as the Pokémon Shock, led to sweeping safety reforms. Japan introduced new broadcasting standards limiting how fast images could flash or alternate colors. International studios adopted similar guidelines, to prevent the same disaster from happening again. For fans, Electric Soldier Porygon remains a ghost episode, never streamed, never re-released, and only available through low-quality bootlegs. It's a grim reminder that even harmless animation can have real-world consequences when creativity overlooks science. In the end, no one died, but the shockwave it caused changed animation forever. Pokémon recovered and became a global phenomenon, but Porygon never did. One bright, blinking moment on screen was enough to turn a simple creature into one of the most notorious characters in cartoon history.